Hello, everyone. My name is Consuelo Hernandez. I'm a 2020 Charles Bronfman convener from Arizona. I earned my MLS at the University of Arizona and my BA in Global Health at Arizona State University. I'm also serving as a governing board president here in the Sunnyside Unified School District. And I'm excited to be here today at the second event in our Critical Neighbors Summer Series, the Israeli-Egyptian Relationship. And for those of you who are new to our community, welcome IPF Atid is the Young Professionals Network of Israeli Policy Forum, an organization dedicated to advancing support for a viable two-state solution that safeguards Israeli security. It is a community comprised of young professionals working to promote a more pragmatic, nuanced discourse around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As Israel continues to broaden its ties in the wider Arab world through the Abraham Accords, its relations with its immediate neighbors, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority, continue to be of great strategic importance, particularly with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel Policy Forum launched its Critical Neighbors Task Force this year to continue exploring Israel's relations with Jordan, Egypt, and the PA, offering fresh insight on the Israeli-Palestinian issues from regional perspectives. IPF Atid is excited to host our Critical Neighbors Summer Series, featuring a new member of the Critical Neighbors Task Force and highlighting a new regional relationship during each event. We're honored to be joined today by Ambassador Hesham Youssef, our task force member from Egypt, who will speak to us about the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. Ambassador Hesham Youssef was a career diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Egypt from 2014 through 2019. He served as Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian, Cultural, and Social Affairs of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, and completed his term in July 2019. From 2001 through 2014, he served as a senior official in the Arab League, as official spokesman, and later the Chief of Staff to Secretary General Amir Moussa from 2003 through 2011. From 2012 through 2014, Ambassador Youssef was a senior advisor to the Secretary General of the Arab League, Dr. Nabil El-Arabi, on issues pertaining to crisis management as well as the reform of the Arab League. And we're lucky to have Hesham with us today, and we'll dive into some questions. Hesham, we'll go ahead and get started. So through Egypt, though Egypt was the first Arab country to establish relations with Israel, ties have only recently begun to warm. And I was wondering if you can speak to what extent the Palestinian issues has a responsibility for this and what has changed.
Well, first, Consuelo, let me thank you for having this with you and with all those who are joining us. You know, it had been for a very long time. They have had their ups and downs, but in general, I think the relations has been quite positive and constructive. And I think what is most important about the relations between different countries is how they resolve their differences. And I think for the most part, except when it came to issues pertaining to the Palestinian question, relations between Egypt and Israel have been dealt with in a very wise and constructive way. And it has always been dealt with in a discreet manner, all kinds of differences. But then we should not underestimate what Egypt and Israel have been able to achieve in their relations in the last 40 plus years since peace has been achieved between Egypt and Israel. So we have had good relations in relation to trade, in relation to tourism, in relation to agricultural cooperation, and other areas. We have had qualified industrial zones between Egypt, Israel, and Jordan to promote trade to the United States. And this was something that was passed by Congress in 1995. And it started working and came into force in 2005. last year, the amount of trade that benefited from this system was around $1.2 billion. So it's not a small amount of money. And then also there is cooperation in the field of energy. Egypt started exporting gas to Israel, and then there were some difficulties. Now Egypt is importing gas from Israel, and only a few weeks ago, there was an agreement that was signed between Egypt, the European Union, and Israel to increase the volume of gas that is exported from Israel to the European Union through Egypt because it is liquefied in Egypt. So there has been progress in relations, steady progress in the last 40 plus years, and we hope that this would continue. But you mentioned the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and I think that is the crucial issue in relation to having how to advance relations between Egypt and Israel. Unfortunately, there is a ceiling, and this ceiling does not apply to Egypt only. This applies to Egypt, it applies to Jordan, it even applies to the newly countries that newly normalized relations with Israel. So at one point in time, the United Arab Emirates found out that it was having some difficulties as a result of all kinds of developments pertaining to the situation with Israel. So did Bahrain and so on. So it will always be controversial, especially when we have tensions either in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, or in Gaza. Then the situation becomes sensitive, and then countries become, more cautious in their approach as to what is visible and what is not regarding cooperation with Israel and advancing relations with Israel.
Thank you for that. And just as a reminder for everyone, please put your questions in the chat box. And I was also wondering if you can talk to us about how Egypt played a crucial role in negotiating the recent ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad following Operation Breaking Dawn. But reports have suggested that tensions are emerging between Cairo and Jerusalem over the latter's refusal to free PIJ leader Bassam Sadi, which PIJ cited as a condition for the ceasefire. Egypt's UN ambassador also sharply criticized Israel as a Security Council in the wake of the operation. Do you believe that Sadi's release is necessary to ensure short-term quiet endures in Gaza, and how else could Israel have handled the situation differently?
Well, yes. There is some tension in the relations between Israel and Egypt recently. And this is, the reason behind that is multifolded. So there were Israeli reports about downing an Egyptian reconnaissance drone on the borders between Egypt and Israel 2 months ago. And then there were Israeli press reports on the presence of a mass grave of Egyptian soldiers in Jerusalem since 1967. And then the latest incident that you're talking about pertaining to the ceasefire agreement and how it is playing out. So let me clarify one of 2 points. And this was acknowledged by both the Prime Minister of Israel and the Minister of Defense. The Prime Minister spoke to President Sisi in order to ensure that things are kept from escalating in any form or way. But in relation to the latest ceasefire agreement, one of the aspects that were included in the ceasefire announcement was that Egypt will do its utmost to ensure the release of Bassam Sadi and Khalil al-Awad, two Palestinians who were apprehended by the Israeli authorities. And then the Minister of Defense the following day came out and he said, well, this will not happen. Knowing Egypt, I'm sure that they did not make the promise to do their utmost except after consulting with Israel. So they probably had some signals that this is not something that would be impossible to achieve. But then another difficulty is related to the fact that Israel is in an election period. And there are all kinds of political maneuvers by different political parties in Israel to ensure that they get the maximum votes, and being flexible on all kinds of things is not something that is taken lightly by Israeli politicians at this point in time. So the question of elections is becoming a difficulty and is proving to be somewhat problematic. So we will see how this will play out, because it can be difficult. Mind you, this is not the first time that these things happen. It happened before on many occasions, including with other countries, not only Egypt. This happened between the United Arab Emirates and Netanyahu, when the United Arab Emirates felt that Netanyahu was trying to use these relations to gain some points in elections, and they didn't like it. And especially at that time, and this applies also to this time, that the situation in elections in Israel is extremely tight. So one seat on this side or on another side can make the difference between forming a government or not forming a government. So this is something that it makes things somewhat more complicated. So we hope that this succeeds, because in my view, when Egypt makes a promise of that nature and it is unable to deliver, then this will make Egypt's role much more difficult in any future military operations or in future wars. And I can be almost 100% sure that there will be another war. As long as there is no progress towards peace, then the likelihood of military operations and wars of this nature is quite high. So if Egypt becomes less credible from the perspective of the Palestinian negotiators who are trying to reach ceasefire deals, then it becomes problematic. So we hope that this would succeed in resolving this issue in a manner that would be acceptable to Israel, but also acceptable to Palestinians in relation to the ceasefire that was achieved, so that this would not have a negative impact on Egypt's ability to play a role in addressing some of these issues, especially that one of them is under administrative detention, and he has been on food strike for the last 170 days or so, and he's in danger of dying at any point in time. So we have to see how this can be balanced, and taking into consideration humanitarian considerations as well, and so on. So I hope that this can be resolved in a manner that would be acceptable, in order not to weaken Egypt's ability to intervene once this is necessary in the future.
Thank you. And beyond that, can you speak regarding Egypt's role, how you see Egypt as a negotiator between the Palestinian factions and Israel, and between Palestinian factions themselves, Hamas and the PA?
Well, between the Palestinians and Israel, just like you mentioned in your previous question about the role of Egypt in the ceasefire, Egypt has always been playing a role in trying to settle, the situation in Gaza. And this has been the case in the last 5 wars that took place, and the recent military operations and so on. And so this has been a constant, and Egypt will continue to play this role, because as far as Egypt is concerned, this is a role that has to be played, because it's important for security in the region and for the Palestinians, the Israelis, and Egypt as well. As for between the Palestinian factions, this has also been a role that Egypt has been playing for a very long time. It has been trying to achieve reconciliation, particularly since the division in 2007, when Hamas took over Gaza, and reconciliation has been facing all kinds of difficulties, reaching agreement but not implementing them, and so on. And this has been the case for the last year, many years. But I think Israel also has a role to play in relation to this issue, because in the previous Israeli government with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he was strengthening Hamas and weakening the Palestinian Authority. And this is not my assessment. This is the assessment of, the Prime Minister Bennett when he was in office, and also Lapid, the current Prime Minister of the caretaker government. So this is an Israeli position by, important political figures. But then the Bennett government came and they said, no, we will have a different approach and a different policy. We will work on supporting the Palestinian Authority, and this would be an objective. And we haven't seen much of that during the period. I know it was a short period, but I think they could have done more. They have taken a number of steps, and we have to recognize that, including having ID cards for several thousand Palestinians and so on. So there has been some effort that has been done, but I think much more could have been done and should have been done in to address this issue. So we hope that this would advance in the coming period. We will have to wait and see what will happen in relation to the next Israeli elections. But based on that, we will see how this will be dealt with. But the final point, I think, is also in relation to what happened in the recent military action. That was also one of the reasons for the difficulties in reconciliation. At one point in time, the Netanyahu government used to say, if the PA goes back to Gaza and an attack comes from Gaza, we will hold the PA responsible for any attacks. And the PA was saying, well, I can't be responsible for everything. There are things that are beyond my control. And Israel was saying no. And then in the last military action against Islamic Jihad, Israel was able to differentiate between Islamic Jihad on one hand and Hamas on the other. So they told Hamas, don't intervene. This is not against you. This is only against Islamic Jihad. So we have to see how some arrangement can be reached in the future in order to see how this can be addressed in a manner that would be acceptable to all those who are concerned.
Thank you. And you mentioned the elections in Israel. Can you tell me, how does Egypt see new elections in Israel? And would the return of Netanyahu to power hamper the warming of Israel-Egyptian ties?
Well, elections in Israel is an Israeli internal issue. And nobody can or should intervene in these elections. So it's up to the Israelis to decide. Of course, our difficulty is a question of an Israeli society that is moving to the right, according to all kinds of Israeli reports. And this is having an impact on the situation regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and also relations with the countries in the region. So we will see what the outcome would be. I think we all hope that whoever comes would be willing to work in a direction that would allow us to achieve some progress in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular.
Gotcha, thank you. And
let me add one more point about Netanyahu. I think one of the difficulties that a number of countries in the region was having with Netanyahu was in relation to his last period, because I think his last period was colored by his fears in relation to the cases that he has in court, and this resulted in him making decisions that were focused more on trying to see how to avoid this indictment and this court case, rather than looking to other aspects that can be equally, if not even more important in relation to some of these relations with neighboring countries and countries beyond the neighbors as well.
Thank you. And what concessions does Egypt want to see made by Israelis and Palestinians to help us get closer to a negotiating point for a two-state solution?
Well, that's a very big and difficult question. Well, there is a lot that has to be done. And I think Israel is going down a very slippery slope as a result of its strength and power. Unfortunately, it is too powerful for its own good. And also the support from the US that is allowing Israel to continue all kinds of policies, particularly during the Trump administration. Now the situation has changed, but not significantly. And of course, as a result also of the weakness on the Palestinian side. So what's happening now is that Israel is appropriating more land. Annexation is no longer creeping, it is continuing to gallop. And if Israel wants to take most of the land, then it will have to deal with most of the people. And that will be a huge challenge for the population of Israel that wants to maintain the Jewish character of their country. So Israel has to make up its mind. Does it want to achieve peace? And if so, how? So this is a strategic question. The answer that we have been getting for the last few years was that Israel was not accepting the two-state solution. They were not accepting a one-state outcome, of course, because it will affect their Jewish character. They were saying no to zero refugee return. They were saying that all of Jerusalem is ours. They were saying, well, we don't even want negotiations and so on. And if you continue to take this position, then how do you expect any progress to be achieved? So this attitude and this approach has to change. We have to wait and see whether a new government will change this approach and this attitude or not, and to what extent and how and so on. So Egypt has been trying to see how to persuade Israel along with other partners, because this cannot be done by any country on its own, except perhaps for the US if it has the political will, and currently it doesn't. So it has to be a collective effort. And one of these collective efforts were being done by what is called the Munich Group, which consists of Egypt, Jordan, Germany, and France, where they presented ideas for both sides, the Israelis and Palestinians, to see how to build confidence as a prelude to coming to negotiation. They also invited Israel and the Palestinians to come and have a meeting, maybe not necessarily together, but have a meeting with the Israelis and then have a meeting with the Palestinians, and then try to see whether there can be a formula where they can sit together with these four countries and so on. So there is a lot of effort that has been done and will continue to be done. But then we need a more flexible and more forthcoming attitude from the Israeli government that would not continue to say no to everything and expect things to improve. So we will have to wait and see what will happen with the new Israeli government, because otherwise my fear is that we are really sliding quite fast into a slippery slope, reaching the inevitability of a one-state reality of one form or another. And mind you, there are many who have been following this conflict quite closely over decades, and they have reached the conclusion that the two-state solution is dead, and which makes things much more difficult. So we have to work much harder in order even to reverse the position that was adopted by those who were extremely supportive of the two-state solution and are now saying, well, you're too late. The situation on the ground does not allow this to take place. So our work is cut out for us and for the Palestinians and for the Israelis and for the Americans and for the whole international community if we want this conflict to come to an end.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question and then we'll check out the chat box to see what questions there. I know there was a few in there, but the last question that we have for you is, what are the best ways for the Palestinians to be included in the growing process of regional normalization?
Well, I wouldn't frame it in the context of regional normalization. I would frame it in the context of regional approach to achieve peace. Because the question is not a question of normalization. The question is a question of how to achieve peace and how the region can help to achieve peace. And mind you, this is not a new invention. This is something that was done before in the Madrid process. So the Madrid process was something about that, is about the same story. It's about the whole international community coming to support the Israelis, the Palestinians, and at that time also others, to achieve peace. So, and we had plans for bilateral negotiations, and we had plans for multilateral negotiations that would consider the role of the region in the context of peace. And we were discussing all kinds of issues, including environment, including water, including regional economic cooperation, including refugees, and including, what's the fifth one? Well, I can't remember. But anyway, so there were these 5 working groups that were in the Madrid process. And what we need now is to see how this can be replicated now. So this is, and in the context of the new countries that have normalized, I think this is not that difficult, but it requires political will. And unfortunately, as I mentioned a minute ago, the problem is in the lack of political will at this point in time. If there is a government in Israel that is more forthcoming in this direction, I'm sure that political will be generated in order to achieve this objective.
Thank you. And we have a few questions for you from the folks joining us today. The first one is, are there initiatives or programs that the Sisi administration can pursue in partnership with Israel in order to mitigate anti-Israel sentiments among the Egyptian population?
Well, let me say a sentence first about the working group that I was forgetting. The working group that I was forgetting was the one on regional security and arms control for the whole region. So that is one. As for the question in relation to the anti-Israeli sentiments in Egypt, the anti-Israeli sentiment in Egypt is limited to one thing and one thing only. And this is in relation to how the Palestinians are dealt with under occupation. And if you see one war after another, one destruction after another, you cannot but, see how the Egyptians are sympathizing with the Palestinians. Mind you, in the war in last May, Egypt decided to donate $500 million in support of reconstruction of Gaza. As you mentioned at the outset, I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1985, so over 35 years ago or so. And I haven't seen Egypt, with all the difficulties that it has economically today, pledging at such an amount to any country in the world. Yes, we try to help those who are less fortunate in our world, in Africa and otherwise, but this hasn't happened throughout my life. So this is another indication of how important the Palestinian situation and the situation in Gaza for Egypt, for the stability of Egypt, for the stability of the region, and for things to move in the right direction. So the question of Egyptians, sentiments of Egyptians are related to Israeli practices, nothing more, nothing less. If this changes, this will change immediately on the part of Egyptians.
Thank you. And the other question, could you offer your thoughts about Egypt's relations with China and Russia?
Well, relations between Egypt and Russia are seen by both sides as strategic. At one point in time, in the 50s and 60s, Egypt was relying on the Soviet Union for the vast majority of its weapons. After the peace process and for the last 40 plus years, Egypt has been relying on the United States for its military defense capabilities and so on. But mind you, Egypt is the #1 importer of wheat in the world. And it gets 70% of its wheat from Russia. And this is a huge issue for food security in Egypt. And it gets also 10 or 11% from Ukraine. So all in all, we get 80% of our wheat from two countries that are at war at this point in time. So the relations with Russia are important. And Egypt wants to have a balanced approach in relation to its relations between Russia and other partners. But the strategic relations between Egypt and the US are as solid as a rock. So it's not a matter of choice between the US and Russia, because we are no longer in a world where countries are choosing between Russia and the United States. And similarly, in relation to China, relations between Egypt and China are mainly on the economic and trade side. There isn't any security cooperation of any significant nature and so on. So the relations are positive relations, and they have been positive relations and constructive relations for decades. And I think they will continue to be as such, because Egypt and China see themselves as strategic partners in this regard.
Technology is on mute. Thank you. The other question, in the event that Abbas dies and there's a power struggle between Hamas and Fatah for leadership of the PA, how would Egypt respond?
Well, it is likely that there will be a power struggle. So this is expected. This is, I don't think that this is something that would be out of the realm. But I think Egypt will continue to try to see how, through dialogue, they can reach an understanding. As far as I am concerned, my hope is that this would be done through elections, and that there will be a solution that can be found in relation to voting in Jews. And then they should all the political leaders on the Palestinian side should allow voters to decide. And then whatever voters decide, that should be the outcome of such a process. But my hope is that it would not turn out to be a bloody confrontation or something that would lead into instability on the Palestinian front, because this cannot also be excluded 100%.
Thank you. And to piggyback off of the question where you were talking about the dependence of wheat, imported wheat, do you know if there was any efforts to use Israeli high-tech like drip irrigation to support the Egyptian agriculture?
Well, as a matter of fact, this has been a long-standing cooperation between Egypt and Israel in relation to all kinds of technologies pertaining to agriculture. And this has been going on for the last 30 plus years. So it's not something new. Israeli capabilities in relation to the usage of water is recognized globally, and Egypt has been benefiting from that, especially at the time when Egypt and the region as a whole is facing all kinds of difficulties pertaining to availability of water because Egypt has very scarce water resources, and so is the situation in Jordan. So I think this is one of the areas that have benefited in Egypt from cooperation with Israel, and I think that this will continue.
Thank you. And in relation to Israel, what is Egypt's cooperation interest with Israel in combating cyber terror and cybercrime? And is there concern regarding growing hacker activity in Rafa on Egypt's border, and an interest in working with both Israeli and Palestinian authorities to address this?
I have no idea. But this is one of the issues that will gain importance in the years to come. Issues pertaining to protection regarding cybersecurity. And we are seeing this globally, how the world is suffering from all kinds of hackers that are sowing havoc in different places around the world. And this will require a lot of work, both in the region and internationally, to see how this issue can be addressed in a more effective way. It was only last year here in the US that some hackers were able to control a gasoline pipeline that goes from Houston to New York, and it was a huge problem. So if countries like the United States can face problems of that nature, I think this can also become extremely problematic in our part of the world. So I hope that the countries in the region would be working on cooperating in confronting these challenges, because they will not go away, and they may result in all kinds of challenges and damages that can affect the interests of all the countries in the region.
Absolutely. And are there amongst the Egyptian public specific expectations from Israel in order to consider the Palestinian issue closed or done?
No. Can you repeat this question again?
Are there amongst Egyptian public, so within the Egyptian public, specific expectations from Israel in order to consider the Palestinian issue closed?
Yes, of course, and it's very easy. And it is the Arab Peace Initiative. And the Arab Peace Initiative has been on the table for the last, since 2002, which is 20 years today. And this is the view in the whole Arab world and the whole Islamic world as to how this conflict can be resolved. And even the countries that normalize relations with Israel have indicated that they still believe that the way to resolve the conflict is through the formula that was presented in the Arab Peace Initiative, namely to have a two-state solution with East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and in a united city, and also to have an agreement that is accepted by Israel in relation to refugees, and so on. So there is an initiative, and there is a position that is supported by the international community, since the Arab Peace Initiative is one of the terms of reference of resolving the conflict in accordance with Security Council resolutions. So there is an international view that is accepted in relation to how the conflict can be resolved. So we hope that this would be the way in which it would be resolved, because otherwise I don't see any other viable alternatives that have been presented in all kinds of ideas, whether it's in relation to confederation or a one-state option or whatever it is. I think that at the end of the day, some form of a two-state solution, perhaps later to lead to a confederation of sorts, that would be something that can work in the context of peace. But this is, in my view, not only what the Egyptians feel is the way to end the conflict, but I think this is what millions of people in the region and in the Arab world and the Islamic world feel, that how this can be resolved.
Thank you. And going back to water, can you talk to us about how have water shortages impacted Egypt's relations to Israel and the Palestinians?
No, this has not affected the relations between Egypt and Israel and the Palestinians, except in as far as we mentioned regarding cooperation in agriculture and cooperation in maximizing usage of water and so on. But this is an eternal issue that Egypt is trying to deal with. And I think there is also some form of cooperation can take place in relation to desalination, for example, that can serve to desalinate water in Sinai, for example, for the benefit of the Palestinians and Israelis and perhaps and the Egyptians, of course. So some of these areas of cooperation can take place, but the water shortage in Egypt is not a factor that is affecting the relations in that direction, but it is an issue that Egypt is struggling to address as part of the challenges facing Egypt in the years to come.
Thank you. And regarding to education, many Israelis worry that Palestinians, particularly those who support Hamas, don't want peace. Is there a role that a peace education can play in mitigating that?
Of course, peace education is crucial and is important. And we have been discussing issues pertaining to curriculums on both the Palestinian and the Israeli fronts for many years. But I think the deeper question is in relation to practices, because when Palestinians face all kinds of difficulties in relation to the siege on Gaza, in relation to crossing points in the West Bank, apprehensions of people, practices in Jerusalem, and so on. This is part of their daily lives and the struggle that they and their families and their parents are having. So you want to teach them something that contradicts with what they see every day and tell them, well, Israel is fine and everything will be fine and so on, while what they see on the ground is something different. So I think education is important, and we should make sure that education does not include issues that are misleading. But then at the end of the day, we need to see how the situation on the ground can be improved in a manner that would lead people to feel that, well, there are improvements, there are things that can be done, and that this can be the right approach to deal with some of these issues.
Thank you. As a follow-up to the water question, can you talk about what's Egypt's role in relieving the Gaza water shortage?
Well, in continuation to what I mentioned earlier, because I think this is part of what can be done on a regional level. It is not limited to water. So we can have desalination plants, as I mentioned, in Sinai that can serve Egypt, Israel, and the Palestinians. And we can have also electricity plants in Sinai that can also serve Egypt, Palestinians, and Israelis. So all these projects can be beneficial to multiple populations and multiple countries, just like we were trying to do with linking our electricity grid with the Gulf countries, and linking our electricity grid with Jordan, and also sending gas to Jordan, and so on. So there are all kinds of benefits that can be reaped as a result of regional cooperation in all kinds of fields. So energy, water, tourism, trade, investment, industrial zones, just like I mentioned about the qualified industrial zones, and so on. So there is a lot that can be done to advance the interests of all those who are concerned in the region. But in order for this to be done in an effective way, you have to have peace. Of course, there are some things that are being done in the absence of peace, but then the potential with peace can be multiplied many folds, and this is what we hope we can achieve.
Thank you. I have a question regarding did including the Islamists within the governing coalition have any impact on public perception in Egypt of Israel?
Well, yes, of course. I thought that this was amazing, but it was amazing for all Israelis as well. So for all Israelis, for the countries in the region, I think it was a significant development. And it wasn't missed by anybody, I think, for those who are following the situation. And I think it's a lesson to be learned by the whole region in relation to efforts to achieve democracy. So, excuse me. So yes, I think that was an important step, and I think that this party had a huge influence on how it was seen in Israel and how it was seen in the region. So it's a beginning of trying to deal with some of these difficult issues in the region pertaining to the link between religion and politics, and how this can be dealt with in a democratic manner.
Thank you. And one last question. Do you feel the Sisi administration has failed to create room for the private sector so Egypt's talented and educated youth can start to bring their entrepreneurs' energy and technical knowledge to advance their economy?
Well, Egypt is facing huge economic challenges. And the government has been trying, but I think a lot needs to be done in order to be able to cross this point. Because I think the challenges are huge, and we will have to see how this can be dealt with in a more effective way.
Gotcha. Alrighty. And we're going to hand it over to Max Webb. I know he has a few announcements. Hesham Youssef, we appreciate you joining us. And thank you so much for bringing your insight and expertise. And we hope
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to join.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Consuelo, for great moderating. We really appreciate it. And Hesham, thank you for speaking with us today. And to everyone that attended, we are so happy that you joined us for the second installation of our Critical Neighbor series. A few announcements coming up, and I will throw them in the chat as well. But we are going to be having the third and final event in our Critical Neighbor series a little less than a month from today on September 20th. That's going to be with Ibrahim Dalalsha. He's going to be representing the Palestinian perspective within our task force, so that's going to be very exciting. We also have a few events coming up in various cities across the country. On September 22nd, we're partnering with the JCC Manhattan and J Street to host Ksenia Svetlova, who is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. She works at Mitvim, a foreign policy think tank in Israel. She was also a former member of Knesset. She's really amazing. We work with her very closely. So if you're in the New York area, please RSVP for that. I will throw that in the chat as well. In Chicago on September 9th, we are hosting the first of a few Shabbats that we're doing in partnership with Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Synagogue. This one is going to be a conversation on Zionism in American Jewish spaces with Jill Katz from NIF and Emily White. It's going to also be an amazing conversation, so I'll add the link there. And finally, coming up soon, actually, that is the last one I have coming up. We will have some more stuff in the pipes for you guys, but please make sure to subscribe to our email as well. And please follow us on social media. That is the best way to stay up to date with everything happening in Atid land. I'm adding everything to the chat right now for you to RSVP for future things. And thank you guys so much. We're going to be excited to see you at the next one.
Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.